Good afternoon, everybody. I am Balmurli Natarajan, Director of the Forum, the Gandhian Forum for Peace and Justice, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you today to the inaugural event of our forum. A very warm welcome indeed for a number of members of the local communities of New Jersey, especially of North Jersey. Thank you very much for showing us your support, and we hope to get your continued participation. I wish to take this opportunity to thank Professor Ishwar Fadia for his more than generous support with seed money for this initiative. I know it has been a long time coming, but it's here now. Thanks also to President Speart and Provost Weil and their team for welcoming and hosting the Gandhian Forum. Also, thanks to Dean Tirado and Dean Basu for their constant support and encouragement. This forum will carry forward the university's mission to be a beacon of public education in the 21st century. It will promote ideas needed to explore and to build ways of living with, enjoying, and meeting beyond our differences. Many faculty members have assured me of their active support in shaping the forum's future. I thank all of you. Some of the faculty thoughts on peace and justice are available at the table in the back. I welcome many more faculty to be part of this forum. A special thanks to Professors Maya Chadha, David Lelyveld, and Pixie Ferris for working hard over the summer and since then to make this forum and this event possible. To the Department of Anthropology and Asian Studies for nurturing bonds of kinship. And to Priya Ravichandran, Alice Armstrong, and Christina Ailo for helping me organize this event. Finally, I welcome students. You are not only the future, but also an integral part of making the present. This forum is for you. To make it your own, to learn and grow with it, and to move forward with its ideas and skills as part of your all-round education at William Patterson University. You'll be happy to know that we decided to name this a forum, which is a marketplace of ideas. And we mean this to include your ideas. Welcome and participate. There's much work to do. Some of the activities that we've planned for the academic year include a student challenge essay. The topic will be announced later this month. A workshop on peace, justice, activism for students, and a round table that links high school students and William Patterson students on issues of conflict resolution. Please look out for these announcements. We have a packed schedule for today. I now request President Speart to say a few words on this occasion, after which Professor Maya Chadha would introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
I'll be very brief. First of all, I bring greetings from the entire William Patterson University community. This has been a long time coming. Professor Chadha and I have had discussions that went back several years. And certainly having the event on the birthday of Gandhi, I think underscores our recognition of the role he played and our recognition of the need for reflection on peace and justice at this time. But for me as a university president, the key addition is the addition to the university community of this entity and the individuals who have worked so hard to bring it about. We can talk about what society needs as a whole, but often when you get locked into those kinds of discussions, you neglect your own society. And I think our community, both in terms of scholarship, but certainly in terms of reflection on the modern day, needs the forum very much. And I'm indebted to all of my colleagues. But I especially also want to note Professor Fadia's role in this program. For me, he will always be seen as the individual who almost single-handedly transformed mathematics at William Patterson University. And for that, I'm indebted to him, and the institution is as well. But it was very gracious of him to put his support behind this, not only in terms of his involvement, but also with some real support that has made this possible. And on behalf of the entire William Patterson University community, I'd like to thank him as well. I don't want to take up any more time, and let me introduce Professor Chadha.
First of all, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Seth and Mrs. Seth for so graciously agreeing to come here and help us inaugurate this function today, Gandhian Center for Peace and Justice. I met Professor Seth, Ambassador Seth, in Tokyo in February, and we had a brief conversation about a whole range of issues. And it was very evident to me that I was meeting with one of those small and rare circle of intellectuals, diplomat, statesman, scholar, who combined in them all these various capacities, these skills, the Mandarin of our foreign service, that India has produced in the past. Professor Seth, Ambassador Seth now, has been an ambassador to a whole range of countries from Middle East to Japan, and has a very distinguished career as a diplomat. But he's a man of many parts. He's also a poet. He's a literary personality. He chairs many forums, and currently he is the director of the Global Security Research Institute at Kyoto University and a CEO of India Global Link. He wears many other hats. He's also chairman of the Japan-India Forum and serves as a visiting professor at IIT, an institute of learning that has a worldwide reputation as being one of the finest institute of learning in the world. I am waiting and been looking forward to this. I welcome Ambassador Seth to come and share his thoughts with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya, for your kind words of introduction. And thank you, Mr. President, for your invitation to come and spend these minutes with you this afternoon in New Jersey. I was asked to speak about the security challenges of the 21st century and how we can wage peace and justice. So I'm going to first talk a bit about the security challenges of the 21st century as I see them. They include what we normally think of as security, military, political, strategic problems, problems relating to the environment, food security if you like, the climate, and problems of security which relate to social and economic disparities in society, which are frequently also a cause of violence. I mean, we have the political, military, strategic causes of violence. We have problems of violence arising from problems relating to food and environmental degradation. You only have to look at the 80,000 incidents of violence in China in 2007 to realize that many of these had to do with problems relating to environmental degradation, security, and people trying to protect their turf. So I've run on ahead. Let me go back, and then I will talk to you a bit about how I see ways out of this and what is the path that we can tread in order to get out of this from my point of view. And of course, because it's Gandhi Jayanti, the birthday of Mahatma Gandhi, I shall, in mentioning ways out, be dealing with the kind of philosophy that he espoused and his many spiritual forebears espoused, and it goes back a very long way, 2,500 years at least, if not longer. So let me begin by saying that mankind has been at a historical crossroads at several points in history. Only in the last century, in the 20th century, we had several of such crossroads. We had the awful cataclysmic destruction of 1914-18, the First World War, where in one day on the Somme, 27,000 Englishmen lost their lives in one day. We think about Iraq today and the deaths in Afghanistan, but the carnage in the First World War on the Somme and in other parts of Belgium was something unbelievable. 27,000 in one day, killed, wounded several thousand more. So we've had that, we've had the Second World War, we've had the Korean War, we've had the Vietnam War, we've had the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 when President Kennedy and Khrushchev and then the head of the Soviet Union almost came to blows. So we've had many of these crises which began as local crises but which developed into crises of global dimensions. And this is what always happens. They begin locally and then they acquire global dimensions with an extraordinary destructive power. Are we at a similar crossroads now? Globalization and innovation have indeed lifted millions out of poverty to standards of living which are unprecedented. I speak particularly of countries like my own and China. But millions more remain challenged by the problems of poverty. We're all challenged by the problems of sustainable development, climate change, rising food and fuel prices, and above all, an increasing propensity to resort to violence, individually and collectively, in pursuit of objectives which are not always clearly defined. More often than not, such violence is impelled by visceral and debilitating hatreds springing from the dark periods in history of those who are prone to such violence. You only have to see the situation in the Middle East, to which I come first. Now, as we look at the challenges which confront us in the widest possible sense, military, environmental, energy, security of life and limb, in my view, one of the most persistent problems is that resulting from the partition of Palestine, 1948-49, which is a running sore, sapping the energy of the countries of the region and all those, which include all of us, which depend on that region for our resources. According to Clovis Maqsood, a Lebanese Greek Orthodox by religion, Lebanese by nationality, now living and teaching in Washington, who's a leading expert in the area, he says that since the Oslo talks of the 1990s, there have been discussions about the Middle East, but no negotiations. And there is a very distinct difference between discussions and negotiations. There's a paucity of recognition, and I regret to say, particularly in this country, that Israel is an occupying power. I know this is election season and everyone is bending over backwards not to be politically incorrect, but I am not involved in the election of 2008, so I can say this loud and clear, that Israel is, in terms of international law, an occupying power which has flouted the UN and its resolutions, flouted the decisions of the International Court of Justice at The Hague, and Israel has never defined its frontiers, proceeds to settle its people in occupied territories, which it calls liberated territories, and this is strictly forbidden by the Geneva Convention. You cannot settle your citizens in territories which are occupied during war. This is the cause of what the Israelis and their friends call rebellion, and which those who are involved in that violence call liberation. and that is the Hamas, the Hezbollah, their allies and their supporters, and as we will see, this includes the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda, those responsible for September 11, 2001. Now, according to senior diplomats who have worked long in this area, and I speak of Ibrahim Brahimi, the great Algerian diplomat, and the Princeton professor Richard Falk, great peace activist who was one of the back-channel negotiators, you may recall, in the Nixon era, trying to bring the Vietnam War to a close. Richard Falk is a great scholar at Princeton. Now, people like him and Brahimi say that the problem is that the collapse of the USSR, which was for various reasons, including internal reasons of the Soviet Union, which caused its implosion, but people in the United States, especially the neoconservatives, felt that the end of the evil empire was the result of the activities of the United States and its allies. Now, this has a modicum of truth. It has a modicum of truth, but the fact is that this mentality led to hubris and the feeling that the United States is above the law. That it is a global state which has a military budget that exceeds all of the rest of the world put together, and that it can do as it pleases, including in Iraq. Now, we see in Iran, still in the Middle East, that in 2003 there was an attempt by well-meaning people in the United States using two former ambassadors actually to India, Frank Wisner and Thomas Pickering. And on the Iranian side, it was Javed Zarif, who was the Iranian ambassador at the UN. Negotiations went on, and the deal was that Iran would be allowed nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, would be recognized by the United States, would be removed from the axis of evil, North Korea and Syria and Iran, and in return, it would stop supporting Hamas and Hezbollah, and it would support the Saudi plan for a two-state solution in Palestine, that is, an Israel and a Palestinian entity living side by side in coexistence. But it failed. The neoconservatives within the administration torpedoed it. And a great chance of bringing peace to the region was lost. This little-known attempt at back-channel diplomacy is significant for what it failed to achieve and why it failed. And that is why I mention it. There are numerous other flashpoints, my own region, the South Asian region, being a case in point, with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda fully operative on the borders between Pakistan and Afghanistan, fully supported by renegade elements within the inter-services intelligence wing of the Pakistan government. And these people create mayhem within Afghanistan and, of course, within Pakistan as well, and fanning out to the rest of the world. In India, every week or 10 days, we have a blast which, in some way or the other, is connected with what's happening on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. There's Russia, with its huge energies, huge resources generated from its energy supplies of gas and oil, which have reached unprecedented heights because of the rise in the price of oil and gas. And this has enabled the Russians to flex their muscles with what they call their near abroad. The near abroad is the countries of the former Soviet Union, the Ukrainians. They can compel the Ukrainians not to sell gas, or not to sell gas to the Ukrainians. And most recently, we know what happened in Georgia. So there's that. The Uzbeks, the Kazakhs have all been subjected to similar pressure by the Russians, mainly for oil and gas pipelines. Then there's Turkey, at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, as it has always been, and with its Asiatic face and its European face. And recently, it has been through a major upheaval with those wedded to traditional norms coming into a clash with what are called the secular forces in Turkey. They have come through it, but there is always the specter of the military there in the background, always ready to intervene in politics. And there are other countries which Stephen Cook of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York calls ruling but not governing military states, like Algeria and Egypt, which, like Turkey, have the military there always in the background, looking down. Pakistan is a very typical case of that too. Well, Europe has its share of problems in this genre. We saw that with the Madrid and the London bombings of 2005, the Paris riots, you recall, on the periphery of Paris, where all the Moroccans and the Algerians and the West Africans live, in November 2005. And even in that most peaceful of countries, in Holland, you had the murder of Theo van Gogh, the filmmaker, who was connected, you remember, with Ayaan Ali Hirsi, the great woman activist from Africa, who I now think has taken refuge in this country or anywhere. She was asked to leave Holland. And then you have East Asia, where I live and work, where there is enormous historical baggage. The relations between China, Korea, Japan, even though economically very intense, at the political level there are tremendous problems of unresolved territorial issues with Russia. 60 years after the war, Japan still does not have a peace treaty with Russia because of the unresolved dispute relating to what are called the Northern Territories. So the short point is that in various parts of the world, there are issues which are causing insecurity, which are flashpoints for violence, which are both incipient and overt areas of visible violence. Now we move on to food security and climate change. These are interrelated issues, and I'll deal with them together. We all know that Norman Borlaug, the great American scientist, 1972, I think, he got the Nobel Peace Prize for having developed the hybrid seed for Mexican wheat, which was later taken on by a great Indian scientist, M.S. Swaminathan, whose foundation in Japan I happen to head, who converted that technology into hybrid rice. And that was the beginning of the great Green Revolution in India, in Vietnam, in Thailand, and other countries. And it was indeed a revolution because we were able to increase our food production from the late 60s onwards 4 to 5 times. I mean, India, for example, in 1949, we produced 50 million tons of food grains. We now produce close to 300 million tons. So this is an advance which cannot be denied. But on the other hand, it has also brought in its wake problems of uniformity. Now, there is a UN treaty on the protection of plant and genetic resources, which has tried to mitigate this loss caused by the uniformity brought in by the Green Revolution. The fact is that whereas we had 7,000 species of cultivated rice before the Green Revolution began, we now have only 150. 7,000 down to 150, and of these, actually, only 12 are used for food production because they are the most efficient. But look at the loss to human diversity, to plant diversity. And I'll come to this theme again. Tomatoes, corn, potatoes, apples, all the same. Loss of variety. And in variety lies strength, because it is variety which enables plants to develop resistance to new diseases. Apples. At the beginning of the 20th century, we had 8,000 varieties of apples. And this country was very important for the production of apples. Now, 95% of these 8,000 varieties of apples have vanished from the face of this earth. And we are the poorer for it. These trends threaten the real achievements of the Green Revolution, which succeeded in Vietnam, India, Thailand, and several other countries in reducing hunger, chronic hunger, from 37%, which it was in 1970, to 17% in 2001. Now, that's quite a big drop. 37% in 1970 to 17% in 2001. This was actually achieved by converting a mere 2% of forest land into agricultural land, leading to a 75% drop in food prices, despite an 83% increase in population. India being a very typical case in point. From 350 odd million, which is where we began in 1947, we are 1.1 billion. So, but as I said, food production from 50 million tons to 300 million tons. So it has more than kept pace, in a sense, with the increase in population. But now, ethanol, the conversion of corn, lands and palm oil and other food crop lands in Brazil, Indonesia, and Malaysia to produce corn and palm oil are threatening the world and the diversity of food crops. Climate change similarly has wrought havoc. There is a small island in the Pacific called Tuvalu, and I read the other day that evacuation from this island has already begun because it is in danger of inundation because of the rise in sea levels. Sweden, the Maldives, by the way, which is very close to us and a member of the South Asian Regional Association for Regional Cooperation, is similarly threatened. It's only about 1 meter above, 3 feet above sea level. Sweden, the home of pine forests, the great Swedish furniture, I think IKEA is originally Swedish. What's happening there? Longer summers, shorter winters. So you have the growth of these terrible beetles. 6,000 of them can kill a 25-meter pine tree in one season. Here's another manifestation of the deleterious effects of climate change. Then there's a great disparity in energy resources. My friend Kenneth Calder of the Reich Institute in Washington, D.C., a branch of the Reich Institute at Harvard, has done a great deal of research on this, and I quote from him, the US has an oil stockpile which lasts for 84 days. Japan is even better. For 160 days, it has an oil supply. But China has a 10-day stock. Likewise, the number of VLCCs, very large container carriers, the ones which carry oil. Japan imports 90% of its oil and gas in its own VLCCs, but China imports a mere 10% of its oil and natural gas requirements from the Middle East and increasingly from Africa in its own VLCCs. So these disparities could be multiplied many times, but they are also some of the reasons why China feels threatened and why China is constantly scrambling to assure its oil and gas supplies. Reaching out in Africa, over 1 million of its people now live and work in Africa. 50 billion of its investments have been poured into Africa, mainly for oil and natural resources. Angola, Sudan, the great oil-producing countries of Africa, is where their attention is focused. Social and economic disparities, which I mentioned to you earlier. In your own country, in 1894, the great philanthropist, industrialist John Rockefeller, had a fortune of $1.25 million, which made him 7,000 times richer than the average American. 7,000 times. There is a magazine called the Alpha magazine, which looks at investors in this country. And I saw a figure in that magazine in 2006, which said that a man called James Simons, with an income of $1.7 billion, was 38,000 times richer than the average American, as opposed to John Rockefeller, who was a mere 7,000 times richer than the average American at the turn of the 19th century. So it is estimated, I'm talking now before what happened on Wall Street a few days ago and the recent crash, but it is estimated that the 25 top, and this is what people in Congress and many of the Democrats and Barack Obama are railing at, 25 of the top hedge fund managers earning about $14 billion have more wealth than that which is paid to all New York public school teachers in 3 years, and is more money than would be required to look after the health of 8 million children. That is what I think Barack Obama is talking about, and those of his ilk when they talk about the need not to have the kind of tax cuts that the other gentleman would like to continue with, and to have the kind of social responsibility to see that these huge salaries going into a few hands, that wealth is used for the greater good of the largest number. Now, of course, there are those who are fabulously rich, the $60 billion Bill Gates being a case in point, who are philanthropic by nature and who are using their great wealth through their legendary foundations. But the disparities and the tax disparities, taxing the rich less and the middle class more, Japan is the same. Taking a leaf out of the Republican Bush book. But you multiply these social disparities with the increasing wealth in India, China, and Russia. The number of millionaires and billionaires that are being produced, 40 millionaires every day in India and 70 millionaires every day in China. So social disparities are not peculiar to America. They apply to all of us. So when you multiply this business of social disparities, these are a matter of reflection. These are causes of concern, and we need to reflect on this as being one of the underlying causes of conflict in the world. How do we go forward? The world community, of course, tries to tackle some of these issues. You've got the UN Committee on Climate Change, of which Rajinder Pachauri, the Indian climate scientist, is the chairman. They got the Nobel Prize with Al Gore. They shared it in 2008 for their great contributions to the protection of the environment. You've got other sectoral organizations, the G8, the G15, the G4, the G3, ASEAN, SAARC, South Asian Regional, BIMSTEC, the Bay of Bengal Initiative on Multilateral Trade and Economic Cooperation. You have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes China, Russia, the Central Asian republics, and a whole lot of others, the names of which many of us do not even know and do not really need to know. But do these organizations have the capacity to tackle the issues and the underlying malaise which induces states and individuals to take the law into their own hands and resort to violence? Do organized religion or religious hierarchies provide us with the answers and possible solutions? The biggest NGO in the world, the Roman Catholic Church, do they have the solution? Obviously international organizations, all democratic states, organized religions, and all governmental and non-governmental groups have a role to play in attempting to bring about some kind of harmony in this divided world of ours. But if I may be slightly provocative, I would say that all these efforts may prove to be insufficient if we do not also promote a value system which, this is a key phrase, a value system which, while affirming the centrality of truth, recognizes and acknowledges the existence of multiple truths. Affirming the centrality of truth, recognizing the existence of multiple truths. The very acknowledgement of multiple truths implies a recognition of the value of inclusiveness. The celebration of diversity, the obligation for accommodation, the need for negotiation, the habit of dialogue, the need not merely to tolerate the other, but to understand, comprehend, and creatively adapt to the other. Offering the other fertile space in which to take root. This is the true unity in diversity, free from exclusivism, provincialism, fanaticism, creating a cosmopolitanism which respects other cultures and is able to coexist with them. This, I think, is a core value. There is a great Igbo scholar from Nigeria, Osointes Onuwime, who spoke of this in the following words: true diversity reaches out to see the value of the other without imposing conditions. The deepest source of all calamities in history is misunderstanding. For where we do not understand, we can never be just. So talking about waging peace and justice, understanding is the key, which arises from inclusiveness and tolerance. Because if you misunderstand, you can never be just, and you can never be peaceful. It is ideas such as these which assist in the process of the individual finding harmony with the universal, of finding a means to live in harmony with nature rather than merely trying to conquer it. Life is never perfect and is always developing, infinitely developing. Individuals are not mere spectators or helpless victims of fate or necessity, but all of us are co-creators of reality with the divine. Very Hindu concept. As the French poet Martin said, man is a fallen god who remembers his heaven. A Christian concept too. We all have a divine spark in us, don't we? And the Hindu concept of all of us with a little bit of the Paramatma, of the great soul in us. So, Tagore, the great universalist, humanist, Nobel Literature Prize winner, the first Asian to win the Nobel Literature Prize in 1913, a great one for putting this idea of man in harmony with the universal. And I just quote a word from him. There are so many of his. If the vision of God has ever been granted to me, I must have received the vision through this world, through men, through trees, through birds and beasts, the dust, the soil. I feel his touch in the sky, in the air, in the water. Everywhere I feel it. There are times when the whole world speaks to me. This is the essence of what I'm trying to convey, the philosophical idea of man in harmony with the universal. Now, these ideas are not merely utopian outpourings of men like Tagore, poets and philosophers and armchair thinkers, but many elevated human beings in history have attempted to put some of these ideas into practice. Some of these enlightened persons have been founders of religions, others have been rulers, and still others had the capacity to be rulers, but chose to remain spiritual leaders and set an example through their own lives, and in some cases through their death. Tagore, of whom I have quoted above, is one such person. I also speak of men like Buddha, the founder of Buddhism 2,500 years ago. The teachings of Gautam Buddha encouraged compassion, love, nonviolence, and tolerance. And one of his greatest pupils was the Emperor Ashoka, who lived 2,300 years ago and who did a lot to propagate the ideals of Buddhism throughout Asia. Now listen to what he says about codifying the rules of debate, because Buddhism was a very egalitarian, democratic religion. There was no priesthood, did not lay down the law. Discuss, discuss, discuss. Reach your own conclusions. And this is what Ashoka says about debate. Restraint in regard to speech, so that there should be no extolment of one's own sect or disparagement of other sects on inappropriate occasions, and it should be moderate even on appropriate occasions. Even when arguing, other sects should be duly honored in every way on all occasions. Nelson Mandela, great pupil of Mahatma Gandhi and Buddha, in his book, The Long Walk to Freedom, speaks of the sense of accommodation that he encountered in the village councils in which he grew up. And he actually practiced what he preached when he became president, you recall, of South Africa in his Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where he met the evils of apartheid with love and compassion and forgiveness. Mahatma Gandhi similarly spoke of an eye for an eye will make the whole world blind. Great man of compassion. And talking of the need for being harmony, living in harmony with nature, which I spoke of a few minutes ago, he said, the world has enough for every man's need, but not for every man's greed. And when you look at the environmental degradation going on in the world today, Gandhi's words ring out loud and clear and terribly prescient. Now, with these simple ideas, he brought down the British Empire while strictly eschewing violence. In fact, you remember that film on Gandhi made by Richard Attenborough. And Attenborough gets this quote from Albert Einstein in the beginning of the film. I forget the exact quote, but it went something like this: in generations to come, men will scarce believe that a man like this walked the face of this earth in flesh and blood. It was words to that effect, but that was the man. Many people realized in his lifetime that this man was unique, that he was a saint. But Einstein put it very well, I think. Einstein, the great Einstein, who said that much more important than knowledge is imagination. One of the reasons why Indian software is better than China. Martin Luther King in this country, another of this line of the Buddha, Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela line, he also got rid of, like Mahatma Gandhi got rid of the salt laws and other iniquitous laws, he fought the laws of segregation in this country with non-violence. Now, in Japan, where I live and work now, another man inspired by the Buddha, Prince Regent Shotoku, 1500 years ago. Amartya Sen, in his book, The Argumentative Indian, has talked a lot about Prince Shotoku. Prince Shotoku was the Prince Regent, and he imbibed the ideals of Buddhism and brought them into Japan from that very advantageous and high position of being Prince Regent of the empire. Now, inspired by the ideals of discussion and dialogue, this is what our friend Shotoku, who wrote a constitution of 17 articles, frightfully democratic constitution, many, many years before Magna Carta. And this is what he says. Decisions on important matters should not be made by one person alone. They should be discussed with many. Nor let us be resentful when others differ from us, for all men have hearts, and each heart has its own leanings. Their right is our wrong, and our right is their wrong. I'll conclude with one final point. It's not as though I'm suggesting that the nation state in which we all live, you live in America, I live in India, presently in Japan, that we must move away from the nation state to some kind of supra-state like the EU. Of course, the EU, the UN, all these supra-states have an intrinsic value of their own. They represent something higher than the mere compromise between nation states. And so they have a value. But for the time being, as Benedict Anderson, the great anthropologist, reminds us, that even world ideologies which began not recognizing national frontiers had to ultimately find expression in nation states. The Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, and Cuba and Vietnam, China are still there. So even communism had to find expression through the medium of the nation state. So the nation state is with us, and for the time being has to be taken as the basis of organization of human society. That is where we have to promote a sense of belonging and togetherness. And our task, and the task of all positive diplomacy for the foreseeable future, is to work within this framework and build cosmopolitan linkages based on deep understanding of and respect for the diversity of mankind, for the rich diversity of mankind. The short point I'm trying to make, and I come back to Gandhi because we are celebrating his birthday today, and others of his ilk, that they've given us the answers to most of the ills confronting us. Environmental degradation, energy shortages, widespread intolerance and violence, and the inability to understand the need for respectful coexistence. They have given us the answers to this. As your great singer Joan Baez said, the answer is blowing on the wind. We have to listen to the wind of compassion, the wind of heartfelt remorse, the wind of forgiveness, and the wind of heartfelt reconciliation. That is the only answer to violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Seth, for a very provocative, thoughtful, and very compassionate speech. It reminded me of what Ludwig Wittgenstein said sometime in the last century, of course. The problem is not that we don't understand each other. The problem is we think we understand each other. And I think there are a number of wonderful gems in your speech that we'll all take away with and hopefully work with it. Our next speaker is an embodiment, in my understanding, of glocalization, a way in which the global and the local do operate together, and without the local, the global actually doesn't even have a manifest form. Ms. Madeline Hoffman is Director of New Jersey Peace Action since August 2000. NJ Peace Action is one of the most active affiliates of the National Peace Action Network, one of the nation's largest peace action networks operating in, I believe, about 27 odd states, and that was started in 1957. Some of the literature is there in the back. Please take some of it when you go. NJ Peace Action's work has been on issues of peace and justice, including ending weapons trafficking, generating non-militaristic solutions to international conflicts, working towards a nuclear weapon-free world, envisaging and enabling economies that are built around peace and conflict resolution at all levels. Ms. Hoffman holds a Master's of Public Administration from Rutgers University and a BA from the Wesleyan University in Connecticut. A regular presenter at events in Jersey, Madeline was the director of the Grassroots Environmental Organization Incorporated of New Jersey for 15 years, where she worked with over 200 citizens groups from every part of New Jersey around issues of toxic chemical pollution affecting their communities. She was selected as a participant in the Initiative for Social Action and Renewal in Eurasia exchange program in 1999, which was in Ukraine. This was an exchange between grassroots environmental activist women in the United States and leaders of grassroots environmental groups in Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. Before holding that position, Madeline was a community organizer, and I'm very happy to say community organizer for the Ironbound Community Corporation in Newark, working with senior citizens living in public housing projects and with residents concerned about toxic chemical pollution in the neighborhood. Ms. Hoffman was interestingly also Ralph Nader's vice presidential running mate in New Jersey in 1996 and ran for governor on the Green Party ticket in 1997. Please join me in welcoming Madeline Hoffman.
Thank you so much. And thank you to William Patterson University for holding this event today. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this event. I'm extremely honored to be here on what would have been the 139th birthday of Mahatma Gandhi. And also thank you for that introduction, especially the reminder about community organizing. That's no wonder I responded to that in the way that I did. Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy showed millions around the world that it was okay to believe in the power of nonviolence to change that world. A call for a nonviolent response to what's going on in the world today may fall on deaf ears or may be somewhat difficult to hear, but this just confirms what Mahatma Gandhi always knew, that using nonviolence as a way to confront those who promote violence, whether that be economic violence or political violence or military violence, is an act of courage and not an easy way out. I'd like to read a couple of quotations from Mahatma Gandhi about nonviolence for starters, and then get into a discussion of what New Jersey Peace Action is, what we have done, how we incorporate the philosophy of nonviolence, and how people around the world, or around this country rather, who have worked to stop violence or reduce violence have actually been successful in this, because we've heard about a lot of the problems confronting today's world, and when we do that, it's easy to say, well, the problems are overwhelming, there's nothing that I myself can do. But what I would like to leave you with at the end of this day is the message that there are things that people can do, there are things that you can do, and there are things that we have already done to make this world a safer place. First, on the issue of nonviolence. Nonviolence, this is direct from Mahatma Gandhi. Nonviolence in its dynamic condition means conscious suffering. It does not mean meek submission to the will of the evildoer, but it means the pitting of one's whole shoulder against the will of the tyrant. Working under this law of our being, it is possible for a single individual to defy the whole might of an unjust empire to save his honor, his religion, his soul, and lay the foundation for that empire's fall or its regeneration. An armed soldier relies on his weapons for his strength. Take away from him his weapons, his gun, or his sword, and he generally becomes helpless. But a person who has truly realized the principle of nonviolence has the God-given strength for his weapon, and the world has not known anything that can match it. A small body of determined spirits fired by an unquenchable faith in their mission can alter the course of history. I think these words are extremely profound and apply to the mission and the work of New Jersey Peace Action and any other non-governmental organization or individual who chooses to speak out and work for social, economic justice. And I would, there's one more line I left out. Nonviolence of the strong is any day stronger than that of the bravest soldier fully armed. And I think sometimes, especially since September 11th, 2001, it seems all too easy to reach for a gun, a sword, a military solution, a violent solution to the problems that exist in this world. And I would think back to what happened just around the time that Peace Action was founded in 1957, and that was when Dwight D. Eisenhower was leaving office. He warned the world and he warned the Americans about the power of the military-industrial complex. And those words from that time were extremely profound, because in addition to the hatred or other things that have caused or that fuel war, war is often over resources. War is often over gaining political and economic power. And the use of hatred between individuals is used to fuel the conflict, but isn't the basic cause of it. And in going back and listening to what Dwight D. Eisenhower said 40 years ago, or 50 years ago almost, gives us some perspective in terms of what is behind this increasing march toward war. In fact, kind of an aside here, when we were talking about the environment and environmental degradation in the world today, I did some research over the summer into the environmental consequences of the war in Iraq. And now we are not just talking about the war in Iraq that took place or began in 2003. We're talking about the invasion that took place in 1991. And believe it or not, from some of the research that was done there, the effects and consequences of that war and the release of oil, the fumes from the burning oil fields, is now recognized as one of the single largest causes of global warming and the shift in global temperature. Now, when we went to war in 1991, I am sure that was not part of the debate, what the environmental consequences of that war would be. And now today, we spend more in terms of prosecuting the war, the use of oil for our tanks and all of our other military vehicles. We use more oil, more fuel in the pursuit of this war, or as much, actually, in the pursuit of this war as would fuel the entire economy of India. So again, when we talk about whether we should go to war or not go to war, these environmental issues are not first and foremost in what we discuss. But if you start looking down deeper, the military-industrial complex not only has led to, at this point, an increasing cycle of violence, but is also behind, in part, the environmental degradation, global warming, and, rising fuel costs, how much we pay at the tank. Did we realize that we're actually spending more on oil than we're getting back in return to prosecute this war? I don't think so. If we did, there might have been a very different decision that was made at the time. All right, back to prepared remarks, but you prompted me to think of some other things to add in. And lastly, in terms of the Eisenhower quote about the military-industrial complex, today, or just last week, I believe, the Congress agreed to a record military budget in the neighborhood of $500 billion, and that is only in what is incorporated into the federal budget. It does not include the billions that will be spent additionally to prosecute the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So when we talk about our economy and the failed economy, we hear a lot of reasons being spoken about in the media, but we very rarely hear about the $12 billion a month that are being spent to prosecute the war in Iraq, and then the $16 billion if you include Afghanistan, and then how much of that money has just come straight out of United States Treasury and been sent overseas. And I think even in some cases, in order to get that money, we've had to borrow money from China and other foreign sources in order to be able to prosecute the war. So it's unsustainable either economically or environmentally. And here, thinking back to Eisenhower, the power of the military-industrial complex. Beware of the power of the military-industrial complex. New Jersey Peace Action was founded in 1957, 12 years after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It is the oldest grassroots disarmament organization in the United States. Many high-profile individuals around the country were concerned about the tremendous consequences of those two bombs. 210,000 people were killed instantly, with thousands becoming ill and losing their lives over time. And even more concerned about the nuclear arms race that had begun primarily between the United States and the former Soviet Union. On November 15, 1957, a full-page ad in the New York Times spoke about a danger unlike any danger that has ever before existed. This ad was intended to begin a national dialogue about the wisdom, or lack of wisdom, of developing nuclear weapons due to their tremendous destructive potential. However, ad signers were not prepared for the quick and widespread grassroots response, which resulted in the formation of 130 chapters of SANE, National Committee for a Safe Nuclear Policy, and 25,000 members, 130 chapters and 25,000 members, about 8 months later. New Jersey SANE, which is the same as New Jersey Peace Action, we've just changed our name over time, was founded at the same time as the National Committee, and so last year celebrated 50 years of working for peace and justice. Our mission includes working for nonviolent resolution of international conflict, shifting budget priorities away from an overbloated military budget into programs that fund community needs, and working to reduce and ultimately eliminate nuclear weapons from the world. It's sobering to know, for me, that this organization has been working almost as long as I have been alive. Except for the first year of my life, New Jersey Peace Action, or New Jersey SANE, has felt and been compelled to be in existence to work for a nuclear-free world. I would like to also give you, in case you are not aware, some of the students perhaps may not be aware of an organization called the National Priorities Project that has information about how the same amount of dollars that are now going into funding the war that would be used to create one atomic bomb or used to create a weapon system, if that money were then used for housing, for health care, for education, this National Priorities Project gives you a one-to-one correspondence, how many teachers could be hired. Similar to what was said before, but a more extensive list, and it applies directly to New Jersey. So you can look at New Jersey's budget and see how in New Jersey's budget, if the priorities and spending were shifted, what could have been done in New Jersey. And you can also look at it by town. How does the war affect Montclair or Newark or Nutley or Maplewood? And so then you can go you could go to your town council and say, perhaps we should be looking closely at what's going on in Iraq today because it's having a direct impact on our ability to run our local government. In many of the last 8 years, New Jersey Peace Action has brought Habakasha. These are survivors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to communities in North Jersey to tell the story of what it was like to witness the terrible aftermath of the dropping of these bombs. Their stories turned what had always been my opposition to nuclear bombs or atomic bombs from an intellectual one into a heartfelt, passionate commitment to ridding the world of nuclear weapons. And it is here I want to focus on the stories of the Habakasha and the work that Peace Action has done in order to show you that people can do something about these problems, and that it isn't solely a matter of the military-industrial complex taking charge, but each of us as individuals can do something, and together, as a movement, we can do even more. The movement to abolish nuclear weapons begun in 1957 with the creation of New Jersey Peace Action, or New Jersey SANE rather, and other similar grassroots disarmament organizations, were influential in getting international treaties like the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty put into place, which put some kind of limits on the testing of nuclear weapons. People were also effective in helping to get the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act put into place, something that has governed the actions, or is supposed to govern, the actions of nuclear states and non-nuclear states. So states like the United States, India, sorry, not India, the United States and Russia and countries that already have nuclear weapons were given a responsibility to work towards reducing and eliminating the nuclear weapons that they had. And there was also an agreement internationally to try to not take actions that would provoke non-nuclear states into developing nuclear weapons themselves. And it's on this note that I wanted to bring in a discussion about India for a minute. There's something that people could do tomorrow, today, right now, to try to stem the tide of a new nuclear arms race, and that is the U.S. Senate is primed to vote today, or maybe tomorrow, on a deal between the United States and India, the United States-India nuclear deal, which would allow India, at this point, to continue to develop nuclear power, but with less international oversight. And because there's less international oversight, there is a concern that India could use nuclear materials instead of using them for peaceful purposes, those could be used for non-peaceful purposes and to develop more nuclear weapons. The other part of this, the other part of this is going back to the whole idea of some countries being able to possess nuclear weapons and other countries not being able to possess nuclear weapons. And if the United States is favoring India and saying, we're going to come up with this deal with you, then it sends a signal to Pakistan that India is in United States' favor. And we have seen over and over, especially since September 11th, 2001, when this president declared an axis of evil, that those countries that are named and targeted as being our enemies are going to have an increased desire to have nuclear weapons to defend themselves. Don't think that countries will take the news that the United States supporting India and helping to develop nuclear weapons, not helping to develop nuclear weapons, but by picking a partner in the controversy, it puts more attention on the other party in that dispute. So there are fact sheets in the back that talk about this deal. There's a phone number to call, a congressional switchboard number to call, and I'll show you. It looks like this, United for Peace and Justice. We have actually stopped this deal. The peace movement has stopped this deal from going forward for about 2 years to this point, but it's now close to being voted upon and approved by the U.S. Senate. And so I urge you to take a look at the information, and if you have a chance, make a call to the U.S. Senate. All right, so the other way in which that grassroots peace activists have been successful over the last number of years is in stopping something called the robust nuclear earth penetrator. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but the United States has a weapon that's just a regular earth penetrator. It's released from an airplane, and it goes through it penetrates the earth. The idea behind the robust nuclear earth penetrator is that it might penetrate more deeply, and it could be used in countries like Iraq to penetrate into underground supplies, underground stashes of weapons. Problem with a robust nuclear earth penetrator is just how it appears. It's a nuclear weapon. And those who were proponents of it said, well, if you drop the robust nuclear earth penetrator, it will penetrate through the earth and the fallout will stay right there underground, and no one needs to worry about nuclear radiation or nuclear fallout. Well, independent analysts looking at it said that those robust nuclear earth penetrators, the fallout could extend for 5 miles in all directions. And so the New Jersey Peace Action and other peace activists around the country said, at a time when we're concerned about Iran having nuclear weapons, North Korea having nuclear weapons, Pakistan having nuclear weapons, how can the United States also say we're going to be researching and developing a new nuclear weapon of our own? It's sending a mixed message, it does not show leadership the kind of leadership that we want our country to show worldwide. So time and time again, I believe 3 years running, the Bush administration tried to obtain funding for the robust nuclear Earth penetrator from the U.S. Congress. And each of those 3 years, grassroots activists were successful in getting their senators and representatives to vote against that particular project. So there is no robust nuclear Earth penetrator. The funding has been zeroed out for now, and we continue to look, to remain vigilant in case it comes up again. But here is an example, a concrete example of how people can be successful in stopping the onset of new nuclear weapons. There's also a program called Complex 2030. I don't know if any of, or 2020, excuse me. I don't know if any of you have heard of that. But this was proposed about 3 years ago, again by the Bush administration. This is not a political speech, it's just stating the facts. The Bush administration said at that point, for a $170 billion expenditure, they wanted to take all of our nuclear arsenal and modernize it, replace it, and then improve it and increase the nuclear arsenal so that we were at least at Cold War levels in terms of our nuclear capability. Now, imagine for a grassroots disarmament organization that has been working for 50 years towards reduction and elimination of nuclear weapons, behind nuclear arms control treaties and the like, to hear a proposal like that, which puts forward a plan to not only increase our nuclear stockpile, but to increase our nuclear stockpile and our nuclear capability. I see I'm running short of time already, but I wanted to tell you about some of the other things that we do very quickly, and then I had some more words from Mahatma Gandhi about disarmament. And so, very quickly in bullet points, New Jersey Peace Action is working hard to try to end the war in Iraq and bring the troops home. We're also working very hard at the moment to get the governor and the state legislature to take action to bring what is now half of New Jersey's National Guard home from Iraq. There's almost 3,000 of our National Guard men and women who are in Iraq, and we want the governor to regain the power on this, not only our governor, but governors around the country, to have power to control where the National Guard is deployed, because the authorization to be in Iraq has expired. We are working to prevent war against Iran. We are working to protect our civil liberties and opposing our government's use of torture. We are working to educate the public about the importance of important peace and justice issues. There's a flyer in the back about our annual soup luncheon coming up on November 15th, featuring Antonia Juhas, who's just written a book called The Tyranny of Oil, the World's Most Powerful Industry and What We Can Do to Stop It. We are also, as I said, opposing the United States-India deal and calling for the U.S. to be a leader in disarmament, not a leader in sparking a new nuclear arms race. And on that note, let me read to you from Mahatma Gandhi about disarmament. All right. Nonviolence is the only thing the atom bomb cannot destroy. I did not move a muscle when I first heard that an atom bomb had wiped out Hiroshima. On the contrary, I said to myself, unless the world adopts nonviolence, it will spell certain suicide for mankind. There have been cataclysmic changes in the world. Do I still adhere to my faith in truth and nonviolence? Has not the atom bomb exploded that faith? Not only has it not done so, but it has clearly demonstrated to me that the twins constitute the mightiest force in the world. Before them, the atom bomb is of no effect. The opposing forces are wholly different in kind, the one moral and spiritual, the other physical and material. It has been suggested by American friends that the atom bomb will bring in ahimsa, nonviolence, as nothing else can. It will if it is meant that its destructive power will so disgust the world that it will turn away from violence for the time being. This is very like a man glutting himself with dainties to the point of nausea and turning away from them, only to return with redoubled zeal after the effect of nausea is well over. Precisely in the same manner will the world return to violence with renewed zeal after the effect of disgust is worn out. He goes on, the moral to be legitimately drawn from the supreme tragedy of the bomb is that it will not be destroyed by counterbombs, even as violence cannot be by counterviolence. Mankind has to get out of violence only through nonviolence. Hatred can be overcome only by love. Counter-hatred only increases the surface as well as the depth of hatred. Before general disarmament commences, some nation will have to dare to disarm herself and take large risks. The level of nonviolence in that nation, if that event happily comes to pass, will naturally have risen so high as to command universal respect. Her judgments will be unerring, but her decisions firm. Her capacity for heroic self-sacrifice will be great, and she will want to live as much for other nations as for herself. This is what I hope, the message I hope the United States will hear, and that I hope you will be part of trying to make her hear. Thank you very much.
We have about 7 or 8 minutes. Questions, discussions, comments.
Yes. I kind of have a question for one for each speaker.
Okay.
Okay. The gentleman that spoke first, right? My question regarding him is that we're hearing a lot of things from this the current candidate for the Republican Party, McCain. A lot of jingoistic rhetoric. Should we fear this? Is this going to be something that's as bad as they're playing it out to be, if he were to be elected?
Is that a question to me? Oh, well, I've spent 35 years as a diplomat and only the last 4 years as a professor. So my first instinct is to answer your question diplomatically. But now that I'm a professor, let me answer it frankly. The rhetoric of McCain is not as bad as it could be. On a lot of things like torture, for example, he's been good on torture, I thought, in opposing it. Up to a point.
And then he's reversed himself.
Oh, has he reversed himself? Sorry, I wasn't aware of that. Because I have been, he has been a champion, having been 6 years in the Hanoi Hilton, very close to where I lived when I was ambassador in Vietnam, along with the first U.S. ambassador to Vietnam, Pete Peterson. They were both in the Hanoi Hilton at the same time. I know what he means by torture generating further torture. So if you torture your prisoners, they're going to torture you, that sort of thing. But no, to get back to your question, there's nothing to fear, I think, in either of the candidates. But I think they're both honorable and patriotic Americans. And McCain certainly has a lot of experience in the realm of foreign policy. But I think some of his views on the American economy, and that impinges on the rest of the world very, very sharply, that is, I think, something that we have to be careful about. Because this unregulated, free-for-all mayhem that we have seen, which brings stock markets around the world, including in my country, crashing down. Because the $17 trillion economy, India is just over $1 trillion. Japan is $8 trillion economy. China is about $2 trillion. So America is still by far the largest economy in the world. And therefore everything, and they may be deeply in debt, as you said so very correctly, that they are borrowing from the rest of the world to prosecute the war. So it's the economy, I think, that you have to be afraid of. On foreign policy, the American foreign policy on either side, I don't think will change very much. There will be changes of nuance, perhaps on the India-American nuclear deal, there may be some changes, but I have a lot of views on that, no time to discuss.
Did you want me to answer the same?
I had a different question.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay.
You were mentioning something about a weapon that's in development. Bunkers and other.
Robust nuclear earth penetrator, yes.
With Iran's odd positioning in support of terrorist groups, if it ever became necessary to go to war with Iran, would opposing such a weapons system put American lives in danger?
Oh, wow, that's quite a question. First of all, I think any kind of military action against Iran puts not only American lives in danger, but the lives of Iranians, Iraqis, and everyone in that region in danger. And for us, we think that it's been really difficult to extract ourselves out of Iraq, and that the destruction and difficulties in Iraq were too hard to handle. It would be nothing compared to what might happen in Iran. And so I fully support any of the candidates who are suggesting that we must have negotiated, we must use diplomacy and really use diplomacy. And I was prompted to think of Albert Einstein before, and Albert Einstein had said something, and I'll paraphrase to a certain extent: you can't both simultaneously prepare for war and build for peace. And so if we go into, the similar thing happened with Iraq. We said, oh, war is the weapon of last, or the tactic of last resort. Meanwhile, we were building up our arsenal. So I think that if we're going to really solve the problem, we have to sit down with Iran and be serious about negotiations. And as was mentioned earlier, there was something on the table in 2003. There's no reason why another kind of deal like that could not be put forward. Nuclear weapons, if you listen to the Habakusha from Japan, they will say that nuclear weapons and humanity are on a collision course. And what we really need to do, and it's not easy to do, but you hear no calls for it, is to create nuclear-free zones, whether they be nuclear-free zones in Southeast Asia, nuclear-free zones in the Middle East. But we also, as a country, I believe, having been the only country to have used nuclear weapons, okay, we have to be the country that leads in terms of reducing and ultimately eliminating nuclear weapons. And I just want to say one thing, because someone tapped me on the shoulder. It is quite possible that the bill I was talking about, the U.S.-India deal I was talking about, did pass last night, and it also has passed in the House. So prior to this, so just something then to read about and understand and know for what's going to happen down the road, and not a call to make, unless our senators voted a way that you would disagree with, and you want to let them know. All right.
Any other questions? Yes.
This is for the ambassador. I really appreciated your very broad understanding of peace and security. Too often in this country, peace and security is only heard about in terms of kind of physical security protected by weapons. And I've been thinking that, in fact, that the governing institutions that we've been, through which we make our decisions, the nation-state system, even the United Nations, are locked in the 18th century Enlightenment paradigm. And in order to get beyond that, because it's so deeply embedded in our consciousness, we have to begin to take into our consciousness the understanding of the Earth system that is based upon diversity, feedback loops, interconnectedness, and so forth, which I think Gandhi and all of the great prophets and peacemakers of the world already understood thousands of years ago. So I just wondered what you thought about that idea.
Oh, I entirely agree. I think in my remarks I made that quite clear, that we have to take inspiration from some of these great teachers who taught us the need to administer to our needs, but to curb our greed. And if we administer to our needs, there is plenty in the world to go around for everybody. There's quite enough in the world, even as large as we are today, quite enough to go around. But then, if one country consumes more than the rest of the world put together, or if two countries consume more than the rest of the world put together, then that poses a problem. It's inequitable sharing of the world's resources, which is the main problem.
I was wondering if you could just talk, I definitely agree with your philosophies about mutual respect and everything. And I definitely think that there's a difference between that and a philosophy of globalization as the key to those things. I was wondering if you could talk about maybe the differences between mutual respect and globalization.
The first globalization in the world, one of the first, was the one that I mentioned, which took place 2,500 years ago, which was the message of compassion of Buddha, of Gautama Buddha. Now that was a globalization in the sense that it influenced the known world from what is Turkey today, through all of Palestine, Iran, Afghanistan. Don't forget the Bamia Buddhas, which were destroyed by the Taliban, some of the finest pieces of Buddhist sculpture to be found in those territories. And right through Burma, down into Southeast Asia, through Vietnam, Indonesia, China, Mongolia, Tibet, Korea, Japan. So this was all a great globalization. And there was intercourse between these peoples. I won't call them countries because they were not nation states then. But there was intercourse between these peoples, between academics, traders, scholars, students. A great university, Nalanda, in the state of Bihar in India, not far from where Buddha was born, had 50,000 students from all over the known world, studying and learning the philosophy of Buddha, studying and learning Indian astronomy, Indian mathematics, Indian medicine, Indian techniques of textile manufacture. I mean, Indians were not just philosophers, they were very adept farmers and very good with their hands, and they were great manufacturers also. Right up till the end of the 18th, early 19th century, India supplied 27% of the world's requirement of textiles. We were a great manufacturing center. Okay? So that globalization, which took place then, was a non-confrontationist one. It was egalitarian. It showed the greatest respect for the other. There were no marauding armies, sword in hand, on white horses. There were monks and traders and pilgrims who took this message of compassion. Ashoka, the emperor that I quoted to you about respecting other sects when you are discussing, he was a great warrior. And at the Battle of Kalinga, which is present-day Orissa in India, many thousands died in one day, and he saw that carnage and it converted him. He became a Buddhist overnight and was responsible for sending this message out. So that first globalization that we know of was a peaceful one. If fights happened, if conflict occurred, it was for reasons extraneous to the globalized message that went out from India. So the two are not incompatible. Now, the globalization that came, for example, with European colonialism in the 16th, 17th century, did lead to conflict. But essentially, it was a globalization that brought the fruits of the Industrial Revolution to various parts of the world. And they came for trade. They came because they were attracted by the wealth of China and India, not their poverty. It was because China and India were wealthy countries that the Europeans came. And if you read a fine scholar called Angus Madison in Groningen University in Holland, he's done a lot of work on the economic history of centuries past. I don't know how he gets his data together. You will find that the flow of gold, silver bullion, was all out from our countries into the West. So they came for our gold and our silver and our spices and our silks and our tea and our great handicrafts and our textiles and our gunpowder. They came for that. And that globalization certainly led to conflict, because largely between the competing colonial powers. The French were fighting the British, and the British were fighting the Dutch, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, they fought the local people as well. So that did lead to conflict, but the first globalization did not necessarily lead to conflict. So today's globalization is what? The PC, the microphone, this business, the PowerPoint presentation, which I don't use. That's the globalization we talk about. It doesn't within itself carry the seeds of violence, as far as I can see. What does carry the seeds of violence is the principle that what I believe is right and what you believe is wrong. What United States believes is right and what China believes is wrong. No. I mean, there are many things that the Chinese believe which are not right, but there are equally many things which the United States believes in which are not correct. They went into Iraq 2003 without any mandate from anybody. Later, the UN Security Council regularized it. So the entry was utterly illegal. The stay has been made legal post facto by the UN Security Council. So, there are, but globalization as we know it today, which is the spread of this culture, the PC culture, the soft power of Hollywood, equally the soft power of Bollywood, which is the great movie center of India. Very strong soft power. The soft power of Korea. Very popular in Japan in spite of their terrible political relations. So, soft power of various countries also leads to its own form of globalization, and we must see that soft power also as being a unifying and a softening force. And there's nothing that we should fear about that, I think. You want to add to that?
I would just like to add something. I would recommend this book by Antonia Juhas called The Tyranny of Oil, the world's most powerful industry and what we can do to stop it. Because where you see the United States invasions, say in Iraq, world's second largest field of oil, sits atop the world's second largest supply of oil. And then Iran has a huge supply of oil. And in terms of Afghanistan and the Taliban, prior to our invasion of Afghanistan, we were negotiating with the Taliban to build an oil pipeline through Afghanistan to pipe out oil from the Caspian Sea area. So when you think about globalization, and I also think about the Project for a New American Century, which was formulated in the early to mid 1990s, with an express purpose of using America's military might and economic might to expand our influence around the world and to import our way of life or export our way of life around the world. And it would include fast food, but mostly, I think, underlying it all is the need for us to have oil. And, a bumper sticker that I saw kind of summed it up. How did our oil wind up under their sands? And Henry Kissinger at one point had said that oil was too important a commodity to be left in the hands of the Arabs. So, there we have, if we're going to export our technology, if we're going to try to export our way export anything, I think when we do it, we have to be cognizant also of the difference between the rich nations and the poor nations. And in Afghanistan, if you look at it, the United States has been involved in one way or another in Afghanistan for about 30 years. And when we were shipping sewing supplies to the girls of Afghanistan after I visited there, we supplied 1 ton of sewing supplies, and we were told that would last the girls for 3 years. And these sewing supplies came from people's basements, from attics, things that we never touch. And I think that's just emblematic of the things that the country like ours has that other countries don't have, and we hardly make that connection. So if we're also thinking about a positive globalization, we have to think about making sure that we close that gap between the rich and the poor nations.
Well, thank you very much. We're totally out of time. Thank you all for coming. Wonderful. Thank you for both the speakers. Please take the material on the tables as we go out.